All righty. Good afternoon and evening, everybody. I hope all is going well with you guys. Numbers are more scarce tonight. So, I guess that's pretty common actually, to have people drop off when they maybe feel like they don't understand things. I was hoping I nailed optionals, but maybe I didn't. Okay. With that being said, were there any questions about conditionals or optionals from what we covered yesterday? Juanita, you said you have a question. Oh, let me open up the Q&A. Okay. So maybe reviewing unwrapping. How do we unwrap optionals? Okay, we can spend a little bit more time on that this morning, or not this morning, at the beginning of class today. To review that, before we jump into loops and functions, any other questions concerning optionals that I can review for you guys today? Okay, so maybe just the unwrapping part of it. Okay, cool. We can go ahead and we can review that for sure. Okay. So we'll cover unwrapping again. I know I had to go through that pretty quickly. We were over time yesterday. But conditionals, probably pretty straightforward. But again, if there are questions about conditionals or optionals, I'm happy to answer them today, or if you just want to review last night's class, the recording is up on YouTube. So you can check there as well. And yes, okay. So let's go ahead and let's cover the unwrapping part one more time, just so that we are all clear. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and open up a playground here. Okay. We'll be doing a blank playground. Let's do unwrapping practice. Okay. So let me go ahead and share this with you guys. Share my screen here. I can get Zoom open. Where is it? Oh, here it is. Okay. Can everybody see this okay, or do I need to change to the presentation font size? It's kind of hard to see. Okay. Yeah, I figured. This is what I use for this is my normal setting when I'm coding. When you look at a screen all day, it's a little bit nicer to have a blacker background. But let's change this to presentation. Okay. So unwrapping, we talked about how we can create optional properties in our applications, right? And what optionals mean is that the value of said property can be set to nil, okay? So when we declare a property, a constant or a variable, and we give it a type and it's not optional, then we always have to assign some sort of value to that property, okay? But if it's optional, we don't necessarily need to assign a value to it, right? Because it can be nil, okay? So remember, we talked about, if I had these constants here, well, let's just do variables. Okay, so we've got my variable first name. It's equal to Johnny. Variable last name is equal to Hicks. variable middle name. Okay, and it's possible that I don't have the middle name. I actually do, but I'm not going to tell it to you because I don't want you guys to steal my identity with all of my names, okay? I'm just teasing. I'm not worried about that at all. Okay, so string is going to be of optional, right? And we'll say, I'll give you my middle initial. It's D. Okay, so let's go ahead and let's say that in our application, we are creating an account for this user, and I want to pull these different properties in, okay? So, you know, we don't have any problem when we're creating an account because we know that first name and last name, we know that they're required. So we can go ahead and we can bring those values in because we know that they're not going to have a nil value. But remember that if your application is trying to use a property and trying to use the value inside of it and that's set to nil, your application is going to crash, okay? So that's why we need to safely unwrap any properties that are optional before we use them, okay? So let's say that I want to be able to use my middle name property, okay? And we'll talk about this today about creating functions, right? But I'm going to do func generate full name, okay? And so inside my function, I'm going to say let first name be equal to first name, okay? The first name that we have above. And then to distinguish this, I can say self.firstname, okay? And then let's say let last name equals self.lastname. Okay, but what about my middle name? Well, I want to create a property here, but I know that my middle name, I can't just say let middle name equal self.middle name, right? Because, let's see if the compiler gets mad at me. Oh, darn it. Still running. Stop this real quick. Change this to manual. Oh, is it not going to let me use self in this context? No, it's because I'm not inside of a class. Okay, fine. Fine. I'll just go ahead and leave it like that. All right. You get so used to only working in applications that use, oh, come on. Fine. Class. You get so used to working in these big projects that you're only ever working in classes that you get mixed up with what works in playgrounds and what doesn't. Now I can, okay, now I can use self. Alrighty. So it's not getting mad at me yet, but if middle name in this case were nil, so if I set this to nil and ran the code that's printing out my middle name, we would see, oh my goodness, wrong menu. You'd see that it gets stuck again. Why? Okay, well, let's read this. First name, last name, middle name, string. Okay, so if you see this, we are trying to print out my middle name, but we don't know that my middle name has a value in it, right? Because we haven't unwrapped it. So you'll see this this warning here, and it's saying you can either provide a default value to middle name, okay, or you can force unwrap the value to avoid this warning. But I don't want to do either of those things because then my application would crash, right? So for my middle name, I need to unwrap it, okay? And in order to unwrap it, I can, instead of doing let middle name, I can do if let middle name. So I'm assigning a new property name, which is middle name, is equal to self.middle name. Then we'll set this to whatever the value is, right? Let's print middle name, okay? Because we know that it has a value inside of it. And then I don't need to include an else because I don't want it to do anything if it doesn't exist, okay? So now what we can do is I can print out my first name, print out my middle name is already going to be done for me, right? And print out last name. And my code is running. Oh, you know what? Why is this having so many problems? Okay. I don't know. I might need to restart my playgrounds. Okay. But this is an example of unwrapping, right? And so we essentially open up our property that's an optional and we make sure that it has a value. If it does have a value, then we can assign that value to a new property and then use that property. Okay. So something that's important to note, and I think Brian had talked to one of the students about this yesterday, is that you can only use this property that you create in this if let within the scope of the unwrapping, right? So I can only use middle name anywhere in between this brace and this brace, okay? So I could, what I could do is I don't want to do anything unless there's a middle name, so then I would put everything inside of that brace, okay? And there are things that you can do to get around that in the sense of maybe I have another property that another kind of general property inside of my class, and I can set the unwrapped value to, I can set that property to the unwrapped value, if that makes sense. So anyway, so that is unwrapping in a nutshell. And I probably already spent way too much time on it, but I hope that helps. Helps you understand a little bit more about unwrapping. Okay. Somebody asked, can you also check to see if the value is not nil? You can check that, but it's still an optional, and so it still needs to be unwrapped, right? So if you were checking that it's not nil and you had an if statement, you could force unwrap it with a bang operator, but you still don't usually want to do that. So unwrapping is a better way to do it, okay? All right, well, let's go ahead and close this. And okay, so let's go ahead and do this, and let's get started with loops and functions, okay? So everybody go ahead and open up a new playground, okay? Just organize my windows here. Okay, so let's open up a new playground. Let's open Xcode up. And mine is already open, so I'm going to do File, New, Playground. And we are going to be using a blank template today. And this is going to be our lesson on loops and functions. Okay, so let's create this. Make this full screen for you guys. Loops and functions, okay? This is probably one of my favorite lessons. It's a lot of fun to use loops and functions in order to solve problems, and you use them all the time in programming, okay? So first off, let's cover loops. So loops, if you think of like a track runner who's running a loop, right? He's running around in a circle, and he's going to the essentially where he started. He goes back to and runs however many laps he needs to run as part of his race, right? So when we're using loops, that's a way that we can run a piece of code a certain number of times, okay? So in order to set up a basic loop, the most basic kind of loop that we have in Swift is a for in loop, okay? Or you can just call it a for loop, okay? So let's say that to start this loop, I'm going to start with the word for, okay? And if I push enter here with the auto completion, we'll get the basic skeleton of these loops, okay? So you can see that we've got for item in a set of items, run this code, okay? So for item, the item right here is just a property name. We can give it whatever value we want, right? I could say X, I could say number here for X, for Y, for Z, for cousin, for character, blah, 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 right? So we can set a variable name there. So in this case, I'm going to say for number in numbers 1 to 10, okay? So within this range of items, right? Let's go ahead and print out number, okay? And it should run our code for us here. My computer worked. Okay, let's run that. Man, I don't know about you guys, but playgrounds are starting to get on my nerves a little bit. They just don't seem to work most of the time. Fine, Xcode, have it your way. I'll relaunch. Okay, so this is where we're at here. Let's open it up and set this to manual. And bring up our console here and run our code. Yes, sweet. Okay, so let's go ahead and look at what printed to the console. Okay, so now we see here that we have the numbers 1 through 10. Okay, so my loop did exactly what I expected it to do. I gave it a property name, which is number, right? And the reason I gave it a name is so that I could use it in my code. Okay, and then I say, so for this item, in items 1 through 10, print that item that we had, right? So print out number. Okay, so up till now, we would have had to write each of these by themselves, right? We would have had to say print 1, print 2, print 3, and so on and so forth, right? But these for loops help us to accomplish the same thing by iterating through a piece of code. In this case, right, it was iterating through the numbers 1 to 10 and printing out my number, okay? So that is a basic structure for a for in loop, okay? And so for those of you who may be having issues with Xcode, to manually run it, go ahead and hover over the plus button or the play button here, and you'll see a little down arrow. And then if you hold down a click on that, then you can switch between automatically and manually run, okay? Okay. Let me go ahead and open up my notes here. Okay. So again, this property here, this item, we give that a name. And we only really need to give it a name if we're planning on using it in our loop. Okay, in this case, we wanted to assign a value to a property and then use the name of that property to print something out, okay? But if, for example, I just wanted to print out a phrase 10 times, okay? So if you've ever driven with kids, are we there yet? Well, if I run this code here, you can see that it's going to print out, are we there yet, 10 times. And I didn't have to give my item a name, right? I just gave it this underscore here because I didn't need to use the value, okay? I just iterated through a piece of code 10 times. I didn't need any item or property name in order to execute what I was wanting to see, right? So in that case, I can just set this underscore here, okay? So let's go ahead and let's do another practice, okay? So let's say, for example, that I want to write a for loop that prints all of the numbers between 1 and 100, but only print out the numbers that are divisible by 3, okay? Does anybody remember how we check divisibility? Modulo, yep, using a modulo operator, okay? So let's go ahead and set this up. So for x in 1 to 100, and then we're going to use a conditional, right? If x modulo 3 is equal to 0, right? So that's how we check divisibility, is that if it has a remainder of 0, then we know that it is divisible by that number. Then we want to print out x, okay? Okay, so let's go ahead and execute this. And let's take a look. We know our multiples of 3, 3, 6, 9, 12, 15, 18, 21, 24, 27, 30. Well, that looks like it's right, okay? So that is an example of how we can use these modulo operators to check divisibility and to only print out a specific number if it meets the divisibility requirements, right? Okay. Any questions up to this point on for loops? Should be pretty clear. Okay, just gone through some of your questions here. Okay, somebody asked earlier if there was another way to unwrap an optional. There is, but you can go ahead and look it up. It's something that's called a guard statement, okay? So write that down as your homework, guard. Okay, somebody wanted to see an example of a loop without using the variable again, okay? So let's say, for example, that I want to trying to think of a good example off the top of my head. Are we there yet? Is one of my better ones, okay? So let's go ahead and let's say for this in 1 to 100, okay? Let's print out whoops, 1 dash dash 1 to 100. Let's print, let's go team. Okay, so I can run that and it will print out let's go team 100 times. Okay, so it's really just you leave it blank if you're not actually using it for anything, right? Because if I did like number here and then I'm just printing out let's go team, well, we'll see that we get a warning that says number was never used, right? You don't need to have an item name here or property name here because you're not using it in your function. Okay. All right. So that is a for loop, and we talked about with our modulo 3. Let me back up a teeny bit. Oop. Okay, we want to print out x, right? So here's where we just were. Now, we've got our normal conditional, which you guys have seen, the if, right? Well, with for loops, you can actually use a where clause, which is kind of nice. It makes the code a little bit cleaner, okay? So I'm going to comment this out here. And let's do this using a where clause, okay? So same thing, for x in 1 to 100, And so instead of closing it off with these braces, like we had done previously, we're going to type in where, okay? And then we say where x modulo 3 is equal to 0, print x. And we'll go ahead and play that. And you can see that it does the exact same thing, right? So this is just a little bit cleaner way is by using these where clauses. Obviously, don't get too crazy with the where clauses and use those conditionals when you need to, okay? All right, so that is a where clause. Okay, I think that's everything for for loops. So let's talk about while loops, okay? So let's go ahead and let's create a variable. My variable is going to be is raining. And this variable is going to be of type bool. And let's say that it's equal to true, okay? So to set up a while loop, we start with the word while, and then we give it a condition, and then we give it a code based on that condition, on whether that condition is true or not, okay? So while is raining is equal to true, print I'm singing in the rain. Okay. I'm going to push the button to run my code unless anyone thinks that I shouldn't. Is there maybe a reason why I shouldn't? Good job, guys. Yep. So this is an example of what would be an infinite loop in our program, right? Because we have this while, and then we're checking a condition. So we're saying while is raining is equal to true, print I'm singing in the rain, okay? And so if I run the code, we'll see that it's already printed I'm singing in the rain over 1,000 times, okay? And so this is an infinite loop, and I'm gonna stop it, hopefully. Probably have to restart Xcode. Wow, we're already at 4,000 times. My computer fans are getting hot. All right, well, let's hope that stops. Okay, so this is one of the problems with using while loops is you need to make sure that your condition is eventually going to change, right? That eventually it's going to reach a false. Because if not, you'll get stuck in this infinite loop. Your app will use up too much memory, your app will crash, blah-de-blah, and then your fans will get really hot, and sweet, it stopped. It only took it like 6,000 times before it stopped. Okay, so what we would need to do then is we would need to set is raining equal to false, okay? So then I could go ahead and run this code, and it just prints it once, right? Because we added a piece of code that is eventually going to make my condition false, okay? So remember that when you're using while loops, they're great, but you have the possibility of creating an infinite loop, okay? So, you know, and is raining, we've got is raining here. Another way that we could set this, we could say is raining is equal to it's not raining, right? That's how we can kind of toggle between the two. So if is raining is equal to true, we'll set it to false. If it's equal to false, we'll set it to true. Well, in this case, is raining is true, so we set it to false, and voila, our code only runs once, okay? So while loop, again, we'll check the condition first and then run a piece of code, and then come back and check the condition. If it's still true, it will run the code again, okay? So another thing that we could do with this is let's say that we've got variable x is equal to 10, okay? And then we can say while 10, or while x is greater than 0, right? While x is greater than 0, then print out x, okay? Well, in this case, it would print out 10 a million times, right? So we need to make sure that we do something with x so that we'll eventually reach a false on our condition, right? So I'm going to go ahead and say subtract 1 from x each time you run through the loop, okay? So I'll go ahead and I run this code, and then we see that we have 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. It reaches 0. It jumps out of the loop. Okay? So this is a while loop. Now something even less common, but still useful, is what we call a repeat while loop. Okay? So using kind of this same property that we have above, let me comment this out. A repeat while loop starts with repeat, and we could say print x, right? I want to print out x while x is greater than 0. Okay, again, I don't want to run this because we haven't done anything to modify x. So we can do x minus equals. And let's run this code. And we see the same thing, 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Okay, who can spot the difference? When would I want to use a repeat while and a while loop? Can anybody tell me? Or any guesses? Cool. Yeah, that's great. So when we want it to run at least one iteration, I like that, right? So if we look here, with the while loop, just the regular while loop, it checks the condition first before it runs any of the code, okay? But a repeat while runs the code first and then checks the condition, okay? So let's do another practice here. And let's say that I want to create a program that wishes me happy holidays every day of December, okay? So let's go ahead and say I've got my variable, which is going to be days in December. And there are 31 days, right? 31 days in December. And let's create another variable, is December, of type bool. That's going to be equal to true. Okay, and so now let's set up a while loop. So while is December, we want to print happy holidays, right? While it's the month of December, we want to print happy holidays. Okay, well, we need to modify our days in December, right? So I'm going to say days in December minus equals 1, right? So it wishes me a happy holidays, and then we remove a day from days in December. And then we need to create a condition, right? And we want to say if days in December is equal to 0, then we want to change our is December property equal to is not December, okay? So let's go ahead and run my code here. And we'll see that it runs through my code 31 times, wishing me a happy holidays for each day in December, okay? Does this make sense to everybody, how we got here? Happy to answer any questions. All right, great. Well, you guys are probably feeling pretty good about loops, so let me give you a challenge here. The name of this challenge, Lambda School Challenge. Isn't that a great name? Lambda School Challenge, okay? Here's your challenge. Let me copy it here. Okay, so I want you to write a program that prints all of the numbers from 0 to 100. Okay, but there's more, right? That's a little bit too easy. For any number that is evenly divisible by 3, instead of printing the number, print out the word lambda, okay? For any number that is divisible by 5, print out the word school. And then if the number is divisible by both 3 and 5, print out lambda school. Okay. Oh, somebody asked why am I not using type inference for Booleans? You know, I actually always like to put type annotations on my properties. I don't really like, I mean, I like that inference is a thing and it's really nice in most occasions, But usually I like to give a type annotation to my properties because it makes my code clearer, right? Makes it easier to read. You don't have to assume what the property is, what data type it is, okay? All right, everybody take until 6:40 to work on this challenge, okay? Okay, so some of you have already finished, which is awesome. Before you post any answers in the chat, let's give everybody else a chance to do it. Some of you overachievers are already done, which is great. All right, take out about another minute or so. All right, let's see some people post their answers. Let's see if they get the same thing. Awesome. Did anybody get anything different than what Brian got here? Okay, so Rebecca's is a little bit different here. Rebecca, try running your code and make sure that that's actually working. Is there ever a case in 0 to 100 when it prints out Lambda School? Oh, have to restart Xcode. Okay. Okay. Or while Rebecca is getting that running, let's go ahead and run through this. Okay. So we're creating a for loop, right? And we're going to say, let's see here. Yeah. For number in 0 to 100. Okay. Let's go ahead and we're going to create a condition. We're going to say if my number is modulo 3 is equal to 0, and okay, so this maybe got some of you maybe fooled a couple of you. Okay, it's pretty easy when you're reading through this to be like, okay, well, let's check 3, let's check 5, and then let's check 3 and 5, right? Because that's the way that the question is written. But if you think about it, and if you ran your code, you probably saw that you never saw an instance of Lambda School in its entirety, right? And that's because we need to check our longest condition first before we run the code. Because if I run my code and let's take 15, for example. I know that 15 is divisible by 3 and 5. If I run the code, and it's going to run and say, okay, is 15 divisible by 3? Yes. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and print out lambda. Okay, and then it's not going to do anything more with 15. It's going to move on to 16 because it already assigned a value to my number property. Okay, so we need to check the most conditions first before we get to 3 and 5, right? So I'm going to do if number modulo 3 is equal to 0 and number modulo 5 is equal to 0, then let's go ahead and print out Lambda School. Okay, so I want it to check those first. Okay, if it doesn't meet that case, right, then, whoa, I don't know, let's see here, 0. Okay, else if number modulo 3 is equal to 0, then we want to print out lambda, right? Else if number modulo 5 is equal to 0, then print out school. And if all else fails, if it doesn't meet any of those conditions, well, I just want it to print out my number, right? Okay, let's go ahead and run this code. So let's go ahead and check, do we have any instances of Lambda School, not schools? Well, I know that 15 would be Lambda School, right? So let's go check. Oh, yep, Lambda School right there, 15. Okay, something that's divisible by 3. Well, 3 and 6 should both say lambda. Okay, something that's divisible by 5, 5 and 10, school and school. Okay, so our code worked, right? Okay, so this is actually a challenge that is really common in the developer world. Normally it's called FizzBuzz, okay? And instead of Lambda School, you have FizzBuzz, okay? Anyway, so you might see this as a coding challenge sometime. So just keep it at the back of your brain as something important to know, okay? All right, any questions on loops before we move on to functions? It's all good. Cool. All right, so let's go ahead and let's talk about functions. Okay, so functions are the building blocks of programming, okay? And what's so awesome about, if you want to clear out the bottom of your playground screen, you can just run your code with nothing in it. Okay, so functions are the building blocks of programming because they allow us to follow a programming principle called the DRY principle, which DRY stands for don't repeat yourself, okay? And so a lot of times in programming, we may want to create a function that morphs a piece of code or morphs some sort of parameter that we pass in and do something with that and use it multiple times throughout our app, okay? Well, it would be a pain to have to write that code again and again. So what we can do is we can store these algorithms or whatever we're doing inside of a function and use that throughout our app, okay? So some of you may not have realized it, but you have already used functions before, okay? And the time that we used functions was when we worked on when we created an IB action, okay? So if you opened up your the project that we worked on during class from the first day, you would see that after the words IB action on your viewcontroller.swift file, it says func, okay? And what that is saying is that it's running a function or a program based on when the user taps on your button, right? Well, functions are the same way. It's a piece of code that's run every time we call that function, okay? And we could even call a function inside of an IB action, okay? So let's go ahead and talk about how to write these functions. Well, we start off with the keyword func here, And then we need to give our function a name. And it's important that when we're giving our function a name that it's very clear as to what it does, okay? Because as you know, as we've talked about before, when somebody comes in and they're reading through your code base, if your functions aren't named properly, the new developer that's there, they're gonna have no idea what that function does, right? So we wanna be really clear about what our function does when we're naming it, okay? So let's go ahead and I'm going to create a function called say hello, okay? So the name of my function is say hello. And then we follow that by 2 parentheses, okay? And these parentheses, they can either be empty or they can contain what we call parameters, okay? And most of the time with functions, you're gonna wanna pass in specific parameters, but we'll talk about that in a second, okay? So this is just gonna be a very, very basic function, say hello, and I want it to print out hello, okay? So, if you ran the code right now, you wouldn't see anything, and you may wonder why, because we have a print statement. Well, I haven't actually called my function yet. So this is just a placeholder that's holding this piece of code. But if I actually want it to run, I need to call my function. And the way that we call functions is just by calling the function name, say hello, okay? So go ahead and run the code, and we'll see that it prints out the word hello, okay? So, next question then is, what are parameters, okay? What can we put inside of these parentheses? Well, these are things that I can pass in when I call the function, okay? So let's say that I want to say hello to a specific person, right? Well, I could pass in a name here, and it needs to be of type string, right? So I want to pass in a name, and I want to say hello. And then we can use, and we'll learn about this, this is called string concatenation. Okay, so I'm just adding these pieces of a string together. So hello plus a space, and then we're gonna pass in my name here, okay? So we can use this, now that we've got this property here, this name property, I can use it inside of my function, okay? So now let's see how that changed things when we call my function. Say hello. Okay, so now my hello function is requiring me to pass in a name, okay? So I can go ahead and I can say Johnny here. When I call my function, we'll run the code, and we see that it prints out, hello, Johnny, okay? So that's what parameters are. Parameters are what's required when the user calls a given function, okay? So in this case, it required me to give it a name before it could run properly, okay? All right, what if we made this an optional, okay? What if it didn't require? Well, we're gonna see, hey, you didn't unwrap your name property. What are you doing, right? So what I would first need to do is I would need to say if let name equals name, then print hello plus space, and then use that name, right? And we could run that, and it still says hello, Johnny, okay? So that's another example of how we can unwrap if we've got an optional, if we have an optional parameter. So then if my name was 0, if I didn't pass anything in, then we could just print out hello, right? Okay, so if I call my say hello function, I can pass in nil, and we see that it just prints out hello. Okay. All right. Yeah, sometimes it can be confusing. You can see here that I use name, let name equal name. Okay, so I could do like let temporary name. That's definitely something we can do. Let temporary name equal name. Okay, and let me teach you guys a cool hotkey. You probably saw me do it, and I actually had someone give me feedback that they wished I would tell them what I did. You saw that I moved this piece of code from like a certain brace to another brace, right? So the way that you can move this without like doing cut and paste is if you have it selected and you hold down Command and Option, and then actually press one of the brace buttons, so the brace buttons, those are next to P, okay, then you can actually move that line of code throughout, okay, so you can see. So I like to do it because it makes it easier than having to cut and paste something, right? See, an easy way to quickly move the code from one spot to another, okay? Anyway, that's not really important. But let's create a new function here, okay? So let's say that I want to create a function that adds two numbers together, okay? So let's go ahead and say func add together, and I'm gonna pass in two parameters. I've got A and B, or those could be X and Y, right? Those, I can name those whatever I want them to be. And then let's go ahead and print out A plus B. Okay, so now when I call my function add together, it requires me to pass in two properties, right? Or two numbers, I guess in this case. So pass in 5, pass in 8, and run our code, and we should see 13, okay? So now I've got a function here that I can call multiple times throughout my app, right? I don't need to go in and do all the arithmetic every time I want to add numbers together, but I can just call my add together function and do something crazy, right? And run the code, and we get a crazy number, right? So that is how parameters work. We've talked about how to call them. Let me talk to you about, we have a few other things to cover before we finish out today, okay? So let me talk about naming these parameters, okay? So going back to our function to say hello, okay? Well, I can actually create an internal and an external parameter name, okay? So let's say, for example, that I wanted to make it very clear to whoever was calling this function that this function is going to say hello to a specific person, right? So I need to give that a parameter name and say hello to, and then a string, right? I want it to say hello to a specific person, okay? And then print, then we want to say hello, and then plus, and then another plus, and then I want to use my parameter name here, right? Because it's who I'm saying hello to. Well, that's kind of weird, right? Hello plus space plus 2, okay? So this would be a really good place to use an internal and an external parameter name, okay? So if I do this to name, okay, then 2 is going to be my external parameter name, and name is going to be my internal parameter name. And it's the name that I can use inside of my function here. So now instead of 2, it's going to say, hey, actually the internal parameter name is name. So use name here, okay? So that makes it a lot clearer to read. But now when I call my function, we only see 2, right? Say hello to Johnny, right? So from the perspective of calling the function, I know exactly what the function is doing, but then internally, it's a lot more readable because I see that the internal name that we're passing in a name, right? And the name is what I want to do something with the name inside of my code, okay? So that's an example of an external versus an internal parameter name. So external is the first name, is the first parameter name, and then internal is the second parameter name. Okay, it's also possible that maybe we don't want to have an external name, right? Maybe I wanted to do, let's bring it back to add together, okay? Well, what if I made these underscores, okay? Sorry, it does have to have an internal name. You can't just do a straight underscore, okay? But what if I make the external name blank? Well, you'll see that we get this error, and it's saying, hey, you need to recall your function because you've got some parameter names that you don't need. Okay, so I can do 7 and 8, and you can see that there's no parameter name. Okay, I have no A and B here. I just put in 7 and 8. Okay, 7 and 8, and we run our code, and we see that it's 15. Okay, so last thing I want to cover before we finish today is return values. Okay, so up to this point, whenever we wanted to print out any sort of output to the console, we've had to use print, okay? But remember, print is only useful in as much as you have a console in front of you, which your users who are using your app don't. So what we do with functions is instead of printing things out, we actually have what's called a return value, okay? And so we want our functions to return something, okay? So the way that we can add a return value to this is after the parameter names, put a dash, and then do the little right arrow, okay? And when I say right arrow, it's like the greater than sign when you're using logical operators, okay? So we're gonna create an arrow, a pointing arrow, and then this is saying, okay, what's our return type? Well, we're going to be returning an integer, right? Because if we add two numbers together, we want it to return a sum, okay? So now in this case, instead of returning, or instead of printing out a specific value, I can actually return A plus B, okay? So now, if I wanted to create a property, and let's say let sum equal, and then I could call my function add together, and I could do 7 and 4, okay? Well, now my sum property is going to be equal to whatever 7 plus 4 is, right? So I can call this function, and the function is going to return an int, and so my sum property is going to be of type int, right? Type int right here. So now, I know we just talked about not printing, but I do want you to see what we get here. Well, if I print it then, we see 11, right? 7 and 4 is 11. So my sum property is equal to 11. Okay. So that is what we get with these return types, or with these return values. So instead of printing, we use return, and then we need to make sure that we give what kind of value that we're going to return, right? Because if, for example, I say, well, let sum equal A plus B, and if I tried to do the old method of just printing out sum, well, the compiler is going to get mad at me and say, you're missing a return in your function, right? The function requires you to return an integer, okay? So in this case, I can print out the sum, that's fine, but I can also give it a return and say I want to return my sum as well, okay? And so that's where the usability of functions actually is huge, because again, we're not printing things out. We're mostly wanting to create functions and having them return a value that we can use later on as we run it, okay? All right, so that is, yeah, that's how we do return values, okay? So for our last challenge, I know we've got 30 seconds left, but I'll give you a few extra minutes. I want you to create a function, okay? I wish I had this typed up. Okay, so I want you to create a function that takes in 3 parameters, okay? And the first parameters are going to be, what's the word for it? I want to make sure that it is clear. We'll say factors, right? 2 parameters, so you're going to have factor 1 and factor 2, okay? And then I also want you to have another parameter that's your limit, okay? And so think back to our Lambda School challenge. Lambda School challenge. I want you to create a function that I can call multiple times, okay? And these parameters, factor 1 and factor 2, are going to be the equivalent of what we used 3 and 5 for in our original Lambda School challenge, okay? And our limit is going to be the top limit that we have, right? So remember, previously we did 0 to 100. I want it to be 0 to your passed in limit, okay? So go ahead, and if you still have your Lambda School challenge, up, and don't go look at Javon's answer. I don't know how he knew we were gonna use this challenge, but If you still have your Lambda School Lambda School loop that we created, you can bring that back up and then just put it inside of a function and then replace all of the things that you need to with the parameters that a user is going to pass into your function. Okay, go ahead and take 3 minutes to create that function. Okay. All right, take about another minute or so. And while you're working on that, I'm going to post your homework so that it's all good to go. Okay. And then in Slack, I just changed the channel topic to your homework, and that also has the link to your daily stand-up. Okay, so let's go ahead and let's run through this. Okay, so let's go ahead and I'm going to create a function, and it's going to be called Lambda School Challenge. Okay, and I've got 3 parameters, right? I've got factor1, which is going to be of type int. I've got factor2, which is also going to be of type int, and then I have a limit, which is also going to be of type int. Okay, so now we want to go ahead and we want to do for number in 0 to our limit if number modulo factor1 is equal to 0 and number modulo factor2 is equal to 0, then go ahead and print out Lambda School. Okay. Else, if number modulo factor1 is equal to 0, then I want it to print out lambda. Else, if number modulo factor2 is equal to 0, print school. Okay, and then if all else fails, we want it to just print out the number, right? Print number. Okay, sweet. So this is what you should have gotten, right? So now I can go ahead and I can call that function. And it says, okay, give me your 2 factors. So what if I do 4 and 8? And let's set our limit to 1,000. Okay, and I run that code. And it loops through it 1,000 times. Okay, well, let's think about this. So 4 and 8, what's divisible by 4 and 8? Well, we know that the first one would be 16, right? or I guess 8, right? Because 8 is divisible by 8 and 8 is divisible by 4. So we've got Lambda School. We've got Lambda School here again, okay? So that's what's so awesome about these functions, right? Is like, look at all of this code that we have here. It's doing a lot of crazy stuff. But if I ever want to use that code again, I can just simply call the function, right? And pass in the parameters that I need, okay? All right, so that's all that we have for today. Go ahead, and I left that link there in the Zoom to your homework. It's also pinned as the class topic inside of our Slack channel. And make sure that you fill out the daily stand-up form as well, okay, after you finish the homework. And that is all that we have for the week today, guys. Other questions we'll get all answer after our class today, if some of you have sent me any questions. But that's all that we have for the week. So I want to see you all back here on Monday, where we are going to be talking about strings. On Tuesday, we're going to be talking about collections, so using arrays and dictionaries. On Wednesday, we're going to be talking about creating our own custom data types. And then on Thursday, it's going to be our last day of class, and we are going to create a table view application, okay? So that will be a really fun one that you guys won't want to miss, okay? So that's all that we have for the week. I will plan on seeing you all on Monday at 5 o'clock, okay? You guys have a great night, and we'll talk to you then.